Okay, we are back, or welcome if you are new. You should check out part one of this. This is part two of the body snatcher. In his young days, Fettis studied medicine in the schools of Edinburgh. He had talent of a kind, the talent that picks up swiftly what it hears and readily retails it for its own. He worked little at home, but he was civil, attentive, and intelligent in the presence of his masters. They soon picked him out as a lad who listened closely and remembered well. Nay, strange as it seemed to me when I first heard it, he was in those days well favored and pleased by his exterior. There was at that period a certain extramural teacher of anatomy, whom I shall here designate by the letter K. His name was substantially too well known. The man who bore it skulked through the streets of Edinburgh in disguise, while the mob that applauded at the execution of Burke called loudly for the blood of his employer. But Mr. K. was then at the top of his vogue. He enjoyed a popularity due partly to his own talent and address, partly to the incapacity of his rival, the university professor. The students at least swore by his name, and Fettis believed himself that he believed by others to have laid the foundation of success when he had acquired the favor of his mediocrely famous man. Sorry, my thing was dying. Mr. K was a bon vivant as well as an accomplished teacher. He liked a sly allusion no less than a careful preparation. In both capacities Fettis enjoyed and deserved his notice, and by the second year of his attendance he held the half-regular position of second demonstrator or sub-assistant in his class. In this capacity the charge of the theatre and lecture room devolved in particular upon his shoulders. He had to answer for the cleanliness of the premises and the conduct of the other students, and it was a part of his duty to supply, receive, and divide various subjects. It was with a view to this last, at that time, very delicate affair that he was lodged by Mr. K. in the same wind, and at last in the same building, with the dissection, dissecting rooms. Here, after a night of turbulent pleasures, his hands still tottering, his sight still misty and confused, he would be called out of bed in the black hours before the winter dawn by the unclean and desperate interlopers, who supplied the table. He would open the door to these men, since infamous throughout the land. He would help with their tragic burthen, pay them their sordid price, and remain alone when they were done with the unfriendly relics of humanity. From such a scene he would return to snatch another hour or two of slumber, to repair the abuses of the night, and refresh himself for the labors of the day. Few lads could have been more insensible to the impression of a life thus passed among the ensigns of mortality. His mind was closed against all general considerations. He was incapable of interest in the fate and fortunes of others, the slave of his own desire and low ambitions, cold, light, and selfish in the last resort. He had that modicum of prudence miscalled morality, which keeps a man from inconvenient drunkenness or punishable theft. He coveted besides a measure of consideration from his masters and his fellow pupils, and he had no desire to fail conspicuously in the external parts of life. Thus he made it his pleasure to gain from distinction in his studies, and day after day rendered unimpeachable eye service to his employer, Mr. K. For this day of work, he indemnified himself by nights of roaring, blackguardly enjoyment, and when that balance had been struck, the organ that he called his conscience declared itself content. The supply of subjects was a continual trouble to him as well as to his master. In the large and busy class, the raw material of the anatomist kept perpetually running out, and the business thus rendered necessary was not only unpleasant in itself, but threatened dangerous consequences to all who were concerned. It was the policy of Mr. K to ask no questions in his dealings with the trade. They bring the boy, and we pay the price, he used to say, dwelling on the alliteration, quid pro quo. And again, and somewhat profanely, ask no questions. He would tell his assistants, for conscience sake, there was no understanding about the subjects were provided by the crime of murder. Had the idea been approached to him in words, he grave a matter was in itself. Yeah. Had that idea been approached to him in words, he would have recoiled in horror. But the lightness of his speech upon so grave a matter was in itself an offense against good manners and a temptation to the men with whom he dealt. I am sorry, I cannot talk today for whatever reason. Fettes, for instance, had often remarked to himself upon the singular freshness of the bodies. He had been struck again and again by the hanged dog. Abominable looks of the ruffians who came to him before the dawn, and putting things together clearly in his private thoughts, he perhaps attributed a meaning to immoral and to categorical to the unguarded counsels of his master. He understood his duty, in short, to have three branches: to take what was brought, to pay the price, and to avert the eye from any evidence of crime. On November morning this policy of silence was put sharply to the test. He had been awakened all night with a racking toothache, pacing his room like a caged beast, of throwing himself in fury on his bed, and had fallen at last into the profound uneasy slumber that so often follows on a night of pain. When he was awakened by the third or fourth angry repetition of the concerted signal, there was a thin, bright moonshine. It was bitter cold, windy, and frosty. The town had not yet awakened, but an indefinable stir already preluded the noise and business of the day. The ghouls had come later than usual, and they seemed more than usual eager to be gone. Fettes, sick with sleep, lighted them upstairs. He heard them grumbling Irish voices through a dream, and as they stripped the sack from their sad merchandise, he leaned dozing, with his shoulder propped against the wall. He had to shake himself to find the men their money. As he did so, his eyes lighted on the dead face. He started. He took 2 steps nearer, the candle raised. God Almighty, he cried, that is Jane Galbraith. The man answered nothing, but they shuffled nearer the door. I know her, I tell you, he continued. She was alive and hearty yesterday. It's impossible she can be dead. It's impossible. You should have got this body fairly. Sure, sir, you're mistaken entirely, said one of the men. But the other looked Fettes darkly in the eyes and demanded the money on the spot. It was impossible to misconvenience the threat or to exaggerate the danger. The lad's heart failed him. He stammered some excuses, counted out the sum, and saw his hateful visitors depart. No sooner were they gone than he hastened to confirm his doubts by a dozen unquestionable marks. He identified the girl. he had jested with the day before. He saw with horror marks upon her body that might well betoken violence. A panic seized him, and he took refuge in his room. There he reflected at length over the discovery that he had made, considering soberly the bearing of Mr. K's instructions, and the danger to himself of interference in so serious a business, and last, in sore perplexity, determined to wait for the advice of his immediate superior and class assistant. This was a young Dr. Wolfe McFarlane, a high favorite among all the reckless students, clever, dissipated, and unscrupulous to the last degree. He had traveled and studied abroad. His manners were agreeable and a little forward. He was an authority on the stage, skillful on the ice of the links and skate of golf club. He dressed with nice audacity, and to put the finishing touch upon his glory, he kept a gig and a strong trotting horse. Ignore that sound if you can hear that rustling sound, because that is my cat being retarded. Stop it! That's why I keep stopping, because I can hear it. I'm sorry. With Fettes he was on terms of intimacy, indeed. Their relative positions called for some community of life, and when subjects were scarce, the pair would drive far into the country in McFarlane's gig, visit the discreet, some lonely graveyard, and return before dawn with their booty to the door of the dissecting room. On the particular morning, McFarlane arrived somewhat earlier than his wont. Fettes heard him and met him on the stairs, told him his story, and showed him the cause of his alarm. McFarlane examined the marks on her body. "Yes," he said with a nod, "it looks fishy." "Well, what should I do?" asked Fettes. "Do?" repeated the other. "Do you want to do anything?" Lee said, "Soonest mended, I should say." "Someone else might recognize her," objected Fettes. "She was as well known as the Castle Rock." "Well, hope not," said McFarlane, "and if somebody does, well, you didn't, don't you see? And there's an end. The fact is that this has been going on too long. Stir up the mud and you'll get K into the most unholy trouble. You'll be in a shocking box yourself. So will I, if you come to that. I should like to know how any one of us would look, or what the devil we should have to say for ourselves in any Christian witness box. For me, you know, there's one thing certain, that practically speaks, all our subjects have been murdered." McFarlane cried. Fettes. "Come now," sneered the other, "as if you hadn't suspected it yourself." "Suspecting it one thing, and proof another. Yes, I know, and I'm sorry, as you or this should have come here, tapping the body with his cane. The next best thing for me is not to recognize it." And he added coolly, "I don't. You may if you please. I don't dictate, but I think a man of the world would do as I do. And I may add, I fancy that is what K would look for at our hands. The question is, why did he choose us two for his assistants? And I answer, because he didn't want old wives." This was the tone of all others to affect the mind of a lad like Fettes. He agreed to imitate McFarlane. The body of the unfortunate girl was duly dissected, and no one remarked or appeared to recognize her. One afternoon, when his day's work was over, Fettes dropped into a popular tavern and found McFarlane sitting with a stranger. This was a small man, very pale and dark, with coal-black eyes. The cut of his features gave a promise of intellect and refinement, which was but feebly realized in his manners. For he proved upon a nearer acquaintance coarse, vulgar, and stupid. He exercised, however, a very remarkable control over McFarlane. issued order like the great bashaw, became inflamed at the least discussion or delay, and commented rudely on the servility with which he was obeyed. This most offensive person took a fancy to Thetis on the spot, plied him with drinks, and honored him with unusual confidence as his past career. If a tenth part of what he confessed was true, he was a very loathsome rogue, and the lad vanity was tickled by the attention of so experienced a man. We're going to stop there, and I will be back with the next part. So far, I can go over what we do know is that apparently the bodies they were getting to dissect and study for anatology was murder bodies. They were not people who died out of basically anything, just died of old age or sickness. They were killed and sent there to be dissected by mob people. But we will be back for part 3, and we will find out what happens.